Good afternoon and welcome to this Friday afternoon session of Time of the Writer. I'm Michelle Constant and our session today is a profound one, Beyond Words, Compassion and Empathy. And in starting, I'd like to just note that how does one even review or facilitate a conversation which is in many ways on grief and loss, the intimacy of it, the dealing of the loss of a beloved child, dealing with one's own thoughts of suicide, clinical depression as a dark mist, family suicide, the stigma, and indeed the silence. These are heavy and intense narratives, and the challenge of this topic today is difficult, but it is with huge gratitude that I want to thank our 5 panelists for sharing their lives with us. We have a group of 5 people, as I noted. The first is Glynis Horning. She is the author of a book called Waterboy, Making Sense of My Son's Suicide, which is published by Bookstorm. Alicia Sudas Ramdari has written a book called Orphaned by Suicide, Life After Losing an Entire Family to Suicide. It's a self-published book. Flora Wietveld, They Call You Dambuza, a memoir on the intersection of 2 lives, focusing on the Zimbabwean Dambuza Marecha and also her own life, Flora Wietveld's life, a story of love which is woven through with mental illness and clinical depression. And finally, we've also got Relebone Riarantsu Africa, who's written the wonderful book, Broken Porcelain, A Mental Illness Journey, published by Blackbird Books. And it is a series of essays which really give you a great insight into what it means to have clinical depression. Truly, finally, this time, Gillian Schutte is a filmmaker, but she's currently making a film about her son with her partner after his death by suicide, and she's written extensively about the experience as well. It is important to note that we have an enormous, slightly enormous, larger than normal panel of speakers, so if we can keep it as succinct as possible, that would be amazing, even though it may sometimes be difficult. And whilst we're unable to cover all the narratives in depth, there are a few touch points that we'll look at. We'll talk to writing about depression, the use of the creative vehicle to understand various different areas of it. We'll look at clinical depression, stigma, and finding health in words. Also, just to note for all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you making the time on this important topic. And we will open up the conversation lines, the chat lines, to ensure that we answer questions in the last 20 minutes or so of the discussion. So just to start, and I'd like to start actually, I suppose one could say it's almost at the end of this conversation, is I'd like to ask each one of our panelists, and given each of your lived experiences, where you are today. And Glynis, if I may, perhaps I could start with you.
Well, as I say in my book, the whole gasps still and I've fallen periodically. It's a very difficult journey to lose someone to suicide, and I lost my son to suicide at the age of 25 2 years ago. And yeah, you churn over forever. So I'm getting somewhere. I'm still around. I'm hanging in there, small steps. Thank you.
Relebone?
I had a very difficult time getting up this morning, more than usual. I've been functioning, I think, relatively well for the last month or so, but there are those days where waking up is particularly difficult, even though there's great things happening in your life. So today was one of those days, but I'm here.
Flora, where are you today?
Well, literally, I'm in my beautiful flat. You see my study. Oh, I'm in my study. You see my bookshelf at the back. And well, I'm also at a point in life, in age, which is quite advanced. So that means that you look back onto many things you have gone through. But I think, and I would like to speak about the way you try to well, as you mentioned in your introduction, how what kind of images you create to talk about depression. Maybe I could give an example of that in my next or so comment.
Absolutely. And I think the next step before we go there is that we do look at writing and how we look at writing, those small steps, as Glynis said, that writing about even waking up, as Relebone says. Gillian, if I may, with you. And just to note, Gillian has mentioned that she's just had eye surgery. So whilst she looks extremely glamorous with her dark sunglasses, it is also to deal with not being able to see properly. So thanks, Gillian.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, like Glynis says, losing a child to suicide, it just completely transforms your life, in ways that when Kai first, he also died around 2 years ago, December 2019. And shortly after his death, I had sort of gone into the space of euphoria. It's very difficult to explain, and that's something I'm also working through in writing. It felt like I had been sort of transported to another kind of reality, and maybe it's a psychological state, there's a kind of chemical that kicks in. But that was extremely helpful, but it doesn't last for that long. Finally that sort of goes away, and then you've got the reality of this gaping hole, as Glynis. Sorry.
Yeah, Gillian, in fact, you do write about it very, very poignantly when you talk about you say the gaping hole, and you call it an atomic explosion, which I found to be incredibly moving, that moment. And we'll talk about that in a moment in terms of the writing as well. Alicia, let's go through to you. Where are you today?
Hi, everyone. I'm more on the compassion and empathy side on these days, on the side of life. And losing my family to a murder-suicide when I was just 12 years old has really opened a lot of facets in my life. And today I'm glad to say that through all the odds, I'm here to inspire and help those that are left behind to pick up the pieces. And I just look forward to celebrating life and learning what has to come of it.
Thank you, Alicia. Flora, you mentioned earlier that there are images, and in your book, in describing the challenge of writing about something like mental health or grief or the loss of someone close, which you also experienced with Dambudza, you actually quoted Nadine Gordimer with the most wonderful quote, where you quote her in saying, "Beauty and literature and commitment do not exclude one another." And I suppose one could say beauty and literature, and one could perhaps substitute grief, one could substitute so many other things, that the beauty and literature and does not mean that each are exclusionary. And Flora, perhaps you could talk a little bit about that in terms of the challenge of writing about a topic which is as difficult as mental health, clinical depression, and the like. Flora, you need to, if you could just switch on your mic for a moment.
So.
There we go. Lovely.
Yeah, I would like, if you give me 2 minutes, I would just quote from my book, because yes, that's where a passage where I find a lot of images to grapple with. And this little chapter is called The Moment of Terror. And it relates to what Relebone said just now, the morning. When I wake up in the morning, there is this moment of terror. That is what I call it. Terror of another day that has to be lived up to. It is like molten lead sprawling through my veins. The crisis of the in-between, the anxiety, the Urangst of the living creature. I'm alive, hence I must stand up for myself, must act, I must. There's no way back into the sheltering womb. This is how I have felt many times. The feeling has no name, but it has a color and a texture. It is a thick foil of fog clinging around me, tight, suffocating, sticky, foggy gray, black-spotted hyenas howling from afar, opaque. Sometimes it is a crow with large wings and a terrible croak circling above me, its shadow noiseless but haunting. At other times, there is an iron ring around my heart. I'm stuck. I can't move. The brain is cramped. The heart yells for help. Or it is a kraken threatening to strangle me, like the hovering crow. I try to duck away, but its tentacles are too large. I can't escape. Trapped forever. No fire escape. So, yeah, I think that gives you an impression of the kind of images that have appeared in my mind and body when I go through, especially the morning depression, because that's where it's usually the strongest.
Flora, may I ask, you talk about being trapped forever and no fire escape. Do you ever feel like there is a door that opens even slightly where you are able to feel something different? Or does it feel as though that door is very tightly closed?
No, I mean, that's because this is just a minute section. That's why I call it the moment of terror. It is a moment. In that moment, I don't feel there is an escape. Yeah. I feel trapped. But then I get out of that moment. And these days, I don't really have such moments anymore. Luckily, at least not very often. But I used to. And the thing is, I don't know whether others have experienced that at all. In that moment, you can't imagine that it can ever be different again. And once you're out, you can't imagine anymore that you were trapped like that. I think that's one of the amazing things about clinical depression. It's not a thought, it's not an idea. It's nothing in your what you can. It doesn't have a logic. It's like a physical feeling.
And it's a profound way to describe it, that moment of terror, the crows, the hyenas, and indeed the krakens. Relebona, I saw you nodding your head a bit earlier. And I know that in your book, there's this extraordinary description where you talk about lying in bed and forcing your baby toe to move, your foot to move, and each part that you have to talk to physically. And Flora, you're nodding your head as well, but just that physicality. Talk to us about that particular experience, but also the writing of that experience.
Hi, everyone. The writing of it was terrible. I think writing, I'm sure some of the ladies on the panel might have experienced or agreed. Writing is its own sort of madness because you are never free from the words. I very much did not want to write this book, but found that I couldn't not write it. And I think that mixed with just, the feeling of waking up and, as Flora was saying, meeting that terror. For me, it feels like disappointment, that, oh my gosh, here we go again. And what do I do to fill my days? Or there's already a whole lot of things that you have to do to fill your days. And all of it feels more burdensome than it does for a lot of other people. And so just the experience of the morning is, if for me, it feels like a fog. Nakane, the singer, says, I've got this fog, it runs through me. And it really feels like that. Like I've got a fog and it's covering me, but it's running through me. Like I'm almost embodying it. And because I've got bipolar depression, the mornings are very much like a slump and the evenings are very much like, a mania. So just to have that up and down of emotion is exhausting. And so people look at you and say, why are you walking so slow? Why are you doing this? Why are you tired? Because they don't know that in your body, so much has been happening. And it's taken literally so much energy, chemical energy, spiritual energy, emotional energy to stay alive. And so things like talking yourself through really help you, because there are so many competing thoughts in your head. And I find that sometimes I have to speak out loud so that, you know, there's an outlet of some sort.
Relebone, you talk about the chemical, the emotional, and the spiritual. So if I may, I'd like to take that idea further to you, Glynis. It's that energy that Relebone is talking about in order to ensure that she is able to get through the day is in so many ways an energy that is required to write a book as well. So I think that to have to deal with the chemical, emotional, and spiritual of A, depression, B, huge grief and loss, and take it into a book, in some cases may be, as Relebone says, far more difficult. I always thought, well, maybe this is a way of just getting it all out. What was it for you?
It was a bit of both. And in a way, it's cathartic, you're letting it out, especially the form of my book, which was largely communication with my best friends, 3 of them across the world, and sharing my experience with them and getting that feeling of universal truth of what I'd been through, and that there were people out there who still offer support. So there is something positive in that, and I would get support in that back from that writing. But it was also incredibly painful, and also because it was jammed between other things. There was still the mundane parts of life. I was still doing editing shifts each day, and I was still writing stories on commission, which was actually good because it kept me busy, so I couldn't dwell too much on what happened. And as soon as that stops, the reality, this boy is gone forever, comes back and haunts you. So then writing about it in a way is wonderful because it let me connect with him again, with the memory of him, but it was so painful at the same time. So there are all these contradictions within it. And I write too about the importance of pieces that I read, bits of poetry, music, particularly odd songs, and that I think is also part of the fabric of how other people's creativity can help you in that kind of way. You tap into it. I hope mine helps other people too.
It was one of the highlights of your book for me, was this idea of how you had this incredible relationship with music throughout the book, and the kind of meaning and messaging that was coming back to you the whole time through the music you were listening to. So I found that really extraordinary. So thank you. Gillian, you know, you are a creative, you're a filmmaker. So in many ways, it would appear that this would be the answer for you in terms of telling your story, to make a film, to write, etc. Do you feel that for you it is a release, or is it not?
It's both. You know, we had made a series of documentaries while Kai was growing up, where we turned the camera on ourselves as a family, and told the story of South Africa and the sort of change in narrative in South Africa through us. So we have a huge amount of archive of Kai from the moment he was born right up until, and then, you know, he sort of took over. So at a certain age, Kai was like, no more camera, you know, and, you know, he was a very willful, you know, only child, and he had his boundaries. And then he became a filmmaker himself, and he had started to make his own little films. So we have an enormous amount of footage. But you can imagine going through all that when the child is not there, and you watching your child, you know, you visually and orally re-experiencing him. So it's been very cathartic in some ways. It's also been extremely hard. I mean, you know, there've been times when Sipho and I are just weeping in our edit suite. We had been making a film before that, which also, it was a hybrid film with fictional elements. And while we were editing that film, we had started there were strange things happening. Like I edited the scene where, because we'd done a whole lot of theatre, you know, grotesque theatre, that's the kind of framework we're working in. And I had put some footage over a person singing of me, footage that I'd found where I was breastfeeding Kai in a train. He was 3 months old and we were taking him to Cape Town to meet his Xhosa family. And Steve and I used to feel incredibly sad. And then I sort of listened to the lyrics and it was, I have to go, please let me go, you know. And there were all these, in retrospect, even then, Sipho had said, this doesn't feel right. It feels like Kai's going to leave us. There was some sort of, something happening, some messaging happening, some little voice in the back of both our heads that this was actually coming. And we only realized this in retrospect. I know it might sound a bit crazy to some people, but and we had cried over that one scene when Kai was still alive. You know, like I don't even know why I edited this. It just, you know, this is happening organically. And then, so while we, you know, going through all this footage and putting this all together, also we're doing an investigation. So we are, you know, we decided that I wrote that article before I really knew. I'd sort of heard little bits and pieces, but I'd started it just didn't feel right. Kai was a very happy child, a very popular child. He did experience some sort of darkness. You know, he was a light being, and he had this dark side as well that used to really worry him. And in retrospect, I realized that was loss of innocence. He had this he loved his childhood. He had this loss of innocence thing that he went through. The more he got into his university career and being part of the A-list kids and being on the top of the ladder with the A-list kids and all that, was incredible pressure on him. It didn't fit his soul type. I think I'm going all over the place. No, but it's building, you know, these blocks and finding out the story and seeing your son. It's very intense. But it's also very celebratory, and you inhabit two worlds. You inhabit this world of absolute celebration, and the gratitude I have for having had a son, having had a child, and having had my child in particular, in our world, and then, you know, the loss. So we, you know, generally we're stable, and then, but both of us go through our own, you know, periods of just, it's actually real, you know.
It is fascinating, this idea of these competing worlds. And in fact, one of our listeners, Lorraine Sitola, has just highlighted Relebone's comment of competing thoughts. And Alicia, I'd like to close upon this with you. You know, you are also, you know, you have written about something which happened to you, the murder-suicide of your entire family at a young age. I mean, you were a tweenie and then a teenie, you know, and to you to write about it, to go back, to tease it open, to tear open a wound, which you must have been really as a young child, and in the book you talk about it quite a bit, trying to just sort of plaster up with a Band-Aid, you know. Talk to us about the reason to write, the need to write. Okay, Alicia, there we go.
Well, the reason to write was actually more of a venting mechanism for me. I started off in around, I think, 2006. And it was always just, you know, things on a Word document until I shared it with a colleague and they found my story really inspiring. I went ahead and wrote down the main story, which was the day of the tragedy when my father took the lives of my mom, my 3-year-old brother, my 8-year-old sister, and then himself. And being a 12-year-old, you know, you don't really see these flags and, you know, the people talk of red flags. And when I started writing this book, and I know every single one of you have been through it as well, the wounds that opened were beyond. And to try and put down those emotions in words, it was just, I wouldn't say scary, but the thought of you just going through this all over again. It took me back into my archive folders in my brain, memories that I chose to, shut off because it was just too much to handle. But I had to reopen and revisit just so that I could write it down to explain to the world what survivors and victims of suicide go through, those that are left behind, the things that we have to pick up, the puzzle pieces to put together, the feelings, the emotions on, do we have to wake up tomorrow morning? Can't I just sleep in? There were days where I did feel highly depressed. I did not want to wake up. I do go through moments where I slip in and out of depression. I am taking counseling. And I've mentioned it as well, where, life does not give you a manual on how to cope after you lose a loved one. And for me, I feel, if someone passes away in a natural form, just say a heart attack or whatever the case may be, you tend to, accept it much quicker than normal compared to that of a suicide where you're questioning, could I have saved them? Could I have done better? So yes, my writing really, I think I took it to another level, and I actually surprised myself with what I've written. I'm not a writer, but it definitely surprised me, and the self-realization of, did I really go through this as a 12-year-old? And growing from there, now 34 years old, looking back, I'm really proud of myself. Like, I am really proud of myself.
Alicia, we've been talking about what it means to have the loss of a child, but what is powerfully moving in your book is what it means to be a child and lose. And I wonder if you could briefly just talk about that moment in time for you as a child, looking back at your child, the child in you.
That 12-year-old girl in 1999, I wish I could go back in time and give her a huge hug. That moment when I got to know that my family is no more, the thoughts that ran through my head were, who's going to look after me? Where do I go? What happens to me? It's all these emotions and feelings that you're feeling in one blow. And it's just something that no child should ever experience. The feelings, I really cannot explain. The loneliness that is felt, apart from the darkness that you are put into. I've related to it as well in my book as some nights I cried myself to sleep, and that was my, the pillow was the only thing that listened to my heartache and the cries. It absorbed my tears. And the feeling of when I wanted to take my life just to be with my family, I felt like I was in this dark room, 4 corners of the wall, just me in the corner, and there's no way out. The only way out for me to get out was to take my life. But I'm so glad that I did not. I promised myself that I would live to see the end of life. But as a child living through this murder-suicide, you tend to see different faces of people as well, this includes family, and I've spoken of that in my book as well. People do change. People change either for the better or for the worse. And it just makes you think that once your parents are no longer, what does actually happen to the child that's staying behind?
So, Alicia, and just to note that Lorraine says, Alicia, I'm sending you all the love in the world. Amai has written an interesting comment, currently reading Relebone's essays, and it's helping me so much as I learn to support a loved one recently diagnosed. Thank you for your bravery and vulnerability. Daniel Alex saying, amazing session. Alicia's raised something which I mentioned to you all off air, was this idea of stigma, and the stigma related to mental health, the stigma related to suicide, and how one is able to deal with it. And Relebone, you actually do, I know that in your book somewhere you talk about it, but what you also talk about in your book is around the idea of silence, the silence of where the silence in a family becomes almost like a character in its own right, like a person that is in the room, which I find completely relatable. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that.
I think when we look at our families, immediate and extended, we find that silence really is like another member of the family. I know in Black communities especially, we all have that one drunk uncle, the one drunk aunt, you know, we all have those characters or people who we've kind of said, these people are the black sheep of the family. And the silence surrounding them is that, oh, but wait, remember that our aunt was XYZ when they were younger, and nobody talks about it. And because nobody talks about it, they find an outlet in you know, any substance that can make them feel less painful, less in pain, rather, sorry. I have a friend who's mentally ill, and she was telling me that when she gets drunk, her brother said to her, it's like you're 5 different people. And I said to her, no, you aren't, my friend. It's just that when you are drunk, you feel like you can now speak because all your guards, your walls, your inhibitions are down. And so your inner child wants to speak. Your teenager who was sidelined in school and at home wants to speak. The person, you know, who they pissed off last week wants to speak. It's all of these suppressed parts of you that suddenly want an outlet. So it's not necessarily that you have 5 different people or that you're schizophrenic. It's just that, you know, finally you find a way to push against the silence. And the silence really does make it worse because I mean, in the presence of silence, you have no other option but to make your own assumptions, your own conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions can lead you even deeper down a hole because you have no way of knowing whether, you know, your thoughts or your conclusions are right or wrong. I think I write somewhere in the book as well, is that a value that I have to have as a person who's living with bipolar depression is to know that my thoughts are not always right. And it has to be a value because sometimes I know that the thoughts that I have, which are very much my own, but also very much the depression, but I say very much my own is because a lot of the time you can't tell, is this the depression talking or is this me? So I have to tell myself that my thoughts are not always right. My thoughts are not always right. And I'm privileged now that I have people who I can speak to, I can say, you know, ramble or just process, which is why listening to people who are depressed is, I think, the number one thing that you can do to help them. But it's not always easy to speak out. So sometimes we ourselves silence ourselves because it's so difficult to say for the 500th time, you know, I'm in the fog again, because you internalize that feeling of being a burden to people. And so I always say to people, my depression is not about you. If I didn't tell you, or if I, you know, commit suicide, know that it wasn't you. It was what was inside of me and me thinking, well, I'm what's wrong with the world. So I have to take care of this problem. I have to go. And yeah, so I send love to Gillian, and I send love to all those who have lost family members to suicide. And as a person who's dealing with depression, to just say that our depression is not about you. It's not your fault. It's just that there comes a time, a moment where it becomes too much. And we feel, it's almost like an act of love. I know it doesn't sound like it. We feel like we want to free you. And so the freedom for you and for us would then come with suicide.
Mm. You know, Relebona, in the book, and Flora, I'd like to take this to you as well. You have this incredible line where you talk about intergenerational trauma, and that the term you use is carrying centuries of ghosts in your blood. And I thought a lot about that phrase because it did start to make me think about what it means to be clinically depressed and a highly functioning depression or depressive. And Flora, I wonder if you could maybe talk about what that means. I know, Glynis, you have said that your son Spencer was a highly functioning depressive, and I'd like to know maybe from both of you what that intergenerational, possibly those ghosts in the blood are. Flora, for you.
Yes, thank you for that question, because I'm actually right now, I've just finished a long essay about my my grandparents, and at the beginning I say I dig into trans or intergenerational memory, and the more the deeper you dig, the closer you get, and you feel that you really, this weight of centuries is with you and doesn't leave you. Even other members of the family who I've never met, I know and I feel it in my bones in a way, the pain they have gone through. So I think that's a very a very important aspect. And like with my brother, he was a manic depression, much more. I mean, I'm also bipolar, but mildly, I would say, and I can cope with it. I stick to therapy or also medical aid to get over it. But my brother couldn't, or he was already 51, I think, when he decided, no, it's enough. And my father always said, yeah, and there was this silence, and he only hinted at, yeah, that's the strain in our family. And he didn't say, my father didn't say that his own sister had committed suicide, you see. I mean, she was already 70 or 71, but still. And only when I started to explore my family history, and I'm particularly interested in these strains of also anorexia in an early time when nobody knew about it, or my other grandmother, who was probably also anorectic and depressive, but she collected menus, cards from dinners with interesting menus, being anorectic herself. So yes, these ghosts are in you, definitely.
Glynis, I wonder if there's an angle on that you'd like to take.
Just that I think that our son's grandfather, my husband's dad, in retrospect, I think he suffered from depression. He was very much a loner, used to go and take meals by himself in his room quite often. And you think that maybe there is a strain of that in there. But at the same time, I think in his case, more important in terms of his depression and what happened was that he actually had a blood condition, which he in fact shared with his grandfather, which was thalassemia minor, which just means you've got slightly misshapen red blood cells, so you don't get quite enough oxygen going around your body. So your levels of energy are very low, and you suffer from fatigue and concentration problems. And I think that got through to his grandfather, and I think it definitely got through to him, and it gets worse because he was in his final year of university studies when concentration is very important. And if your energy levels are low, this makes you a sitting duck. And since the book, I've had a number of people contact me on that angle of it, which was interesting, saying they think that being anemic or having any kind of sort of blood condition, maybe vegans, it can also add to depression. So I think it's important that we're all aware of that angle of things as well. But yeah, I think there is a degree of this sort of thing in the blood.
Glynis, one of the things I thought about, and I don't mean this glibly, was in your book was this idea of having to be a detective, and feeling really strongly like you needed to do all this incredible research following your son's activity on the internet, like where had he accessed, where had he gone, which sites had he accessed. Then of course there's the medical stuff, which you're talking, the medical stuff that you've just spoken about now. Is that a sense, and Gillian, we'll go to you as well on that, but is that a sense of, for you, that was absolutely critical, with that you felt it was desperate to understand?
Totally. I mean, the subtitle of my book is Waterboy, Making Sense of My Son's Suicide. And that is it. It's churning. It's trying to understand what happened. And I suppose reaching to see if there was anything one could have done, which is why I found your other speakers so very moving and sharing what the realities of depression actually are. To take us there to feel and hear those black crows, and to actually hear those words, it's not your fault. It was our depression. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I find it gets to me still, because 2.5 years afterwards, one still flagellates oneself and one still looks for answers. So they are very brave, and thank you for sharing that with people like us. We need to hear that.
I think all of us need to hear that, Glynis. So I thank you for opening up on that. Gillian, when you hear what Relebohene says, and also Flora's comment about, I mean, as Glynis says, the crows and the crows and the krakens, and what does it feel for you? How do you feel your response to hearing the writing of it?
I felt deeply comforted when Relebohene was speaking, you know, when she mentioned those words, and it felt like it was a message. Like Glynis, I also, you know, I mean, I was looking through one of Kai's hard drives, and the first picture that came up was an image he had done, a suicide image. And that was such a shock, because then I had to start piecing together the fact that there must have been some sort of suicide ideation or romanticization, because they have these subcultures. I don't know about Durban, but Johannesburg youth pretty complex, and I've been into that world quite deeply now, where they develop these subcultures, you know, and it's largely to do with the anxiety that our world presents them right now. There's so much externalization of your sense of self, your libidinal self, etc. And I think it creates a lot of schisms. And then, you know, but the point is that my son would speak to me about everything. He was a completely open book. And he did tell me that he had this dark passenger. And so there are other forms of mental illness, which I also think need to be highlighted, that, for instance, there's this thing called obsessive compulsive harm thoughts. It's very different to obsessive compulsive thinking. I had that as a teenager growing up, but I had a very tumultuous, very bad childhood. And then my son, and this might be also something passed through the process of osmosis or DNA, started to tell me that he had these harm thoughts, these thoughts that were just not him, where you think you're going to harm somebody, but you're not, you know. And I mean, when you read up on that, it's very understudied. But I was able to speak kind of through that, because when I eventually told my mother at the age of 15, my mother told me her syndrome, and it passed from my mother to me to my son. And I took him to therapy for that, because he started to think he was a bad person. He was such a good person that he had to be bad in some way. And I had to take him to have his whole sort of, to be tested, because he came to me at the age of 10 and said, Mum, I think I'm a psychopath. And they had done something at a school about psychopaths, and suddenly he had absorbed this. And then I would say to him, but, you know, how do you feel when you see, you know, because he was the kind of child who would cry if an old man came to ask for money, and he said, shame he doesn't have a mommy and daddy, you know, he's an old man. And so I would take him through this whole process of how do you feel, and, you know, and that's, you know, you're an empath, more than anything, you're an empath. However, I had to take him for this test so that he was assured that he wasn't a psychopath. So that's a kind of obsessive compulsive thought. And I think a lot of teenagers suffer from that, and I don't think it's something that's really recognized.
Yeah.
They honestly think they're bad, or they're going to do something bad, and it's a terrible state to live. I lived in that state myself. But, you know, once I'd taken him for that and I'd spoken him through, I thought he was fine. He had put it to rest. But then I discovered that he hadn't. So yeah, there's a lot of beating yourself up about certain things. There is some guilt, but there's also this I don't know, that's something I'll probably leave for my book though, there's also this transcendental kind of way of dealing with suicide and somebody's life and the message they came here to leave.
Yeah.
And
So, we're gonna have to start thinking about closing comments in a moment. But before I go to closing comments, I'd like to ask all of you one thing. Glynis, in your book, and it was at the memorial service, if I remember correctly, of your child, you quote from Shakespeare's Life and Death of King John. And the quote is, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child." And I was just thinking about that quote, and it's so interesting because all of you in your books or in your writing talk about there's this fog, the mist, this coat of that stickiness, and you've all mentioned something of that nature, which makes me realize that it is not. Loss is not about emptiness. Loss is about everything else that fills up into that space. And I wonder if you could perhaps very briefly just interrogate that idea for me, if you may. Alicia, I'll start with you.
I couldn't agree more with that. Loss is definitely everything. When I look back, actually, it still happens to me these days when you go through certain things and you just wish that your mom or your sibling or your dad was still here. There's everything that you look at reminds you of them. They do fill up that room. Each one of you here has brought so much to the table today. And, my heart is so full with sorrow today that, I can relate to you and how you speak of your loved ones that have been lost. And this thing of grief, it hurts for the days and years to come. It's not something that is going to go away. And all we can do is just live in those memories and cherish those memories that our loved ones have left with us. And let that room be filled with that warmth that they brought to us. And get rid of that cold emptiness that was once there. Let them live in that room forever and ever. That's all I can say about that.
Thank you, Alicia. Flora. Flora, if I may put that question to you as well.
Yes, loss it fills you up, and I would get back to our initial question about how to write about it, and how, just now you also talked about to make sense of something. I found that in writing, you transcend the immediate level of feeling that loss, feeling that depression, and trying to get it on a different level. And what I found is that, I think people always want to make sense of things they can't understand. I think that's also the source of myth, of mythology. And so in my book, in my memoir, I've, without thinking about that, without really having the plan to do it, but I've come up with my own mythical tales, for instance, about my HIV infection and what that meant. All of a sudden, I could link it also to the germ of new life. And with my brother's leaving that world by his own will, I had the term of the valley of death, because I at the same time was going through a phase of of a lymphoid cancer, which I didn't know yet. So I was kind of descending into that valley of death. And of course, I'm not at all esoteric. I don't think it's like that, but still, it helps to have this kind of closure about loss and about angst, about this Urangst, as I said, this very primeval, hole in yourself where you feel like you will sink into it if you don't find words to grasp it, to contain it.
And you talk about that you will sink into it, and I just need to find, it was a quote of something that Gillian said, which was, and I just need to find it, my apologies, which made me think a lot about exactly what you said now, where Gillian said something about falling, free falling. And I wondered, if one goes into this black hole, this free fall, what is it that hooks you to hold you back from the ultimate free fall? Gillian, perhaps you could just briefly go into that.
The first word that came to mind as you were saying that was love, really. And that's when I say I went into a euphoric stage, all I could feel was love at one point, just pure love. It's like, that's what kind of opened me up to, which I'm grateful for. That's what it was. And as I say, it's not something that's, you can sustain unless you're like a saint. For long, but I did a lot of writing. I wrote whatever came to mind at that point. And that was extremely cathartic, and it was very much based on that concept of the love that he left, and the love, and he just opened up to this whole sort of interconnectedness of love globally, universally, multiversely. That's what stopped me from free falling, from hitting rock bottom. I was able to stay in a space where I could survive this, basically. That's what it was. And it hasn't entirely gone. It's something that changed. It's something that changed structurally. It's changed my structure of even perceiving the world, etc. It's still there, but it does not mean that the sorrow, the gaping hole, and all that stuff is not there. It's still there as well. But I love what Alicia said about letting them fill that room with their warmth and their love, and instead of the cold, dark, clinical room. And I think that this thing of energy never dies. Energy itself, and this is scientific, it's not exactly esoteric, but it's where science and esoteric meet. Energy doesn't die, that energy remains. It's just in a different form. And that's something that sort of kept me feeling Kai, feeling his presence. And even if his presence is not there, just knowing that his energy, we have coping mechanisms, and sometimes they take us to places we didn't expect. Yeah.
Glynis,
thank you.
The room, if you have to go into that room, the filling up of the room. Quote, the Shakespeare quote.
I think, again, love is the only solution. Love, and then memories. I mean, this is the thing, the boy thought memories might help us, because in his note he said, Mom, Dad, love you all, and thanks for the wonderful memories. I'll always be there in yours. But the problem is, and I just hope people who might contemplate something like suicide, maybe people who even watching or listening, will remember and think of it, that even the memories that you leave, wonderful as they are so painful. I mean, my younger son, I've got two boys, has found videos of my child, as a little boy, as not even a year old, walking up to me and giving me a kiss, holding me around the ankles. Those memories are so precious and wonderful, but they are just so poignant and so full of pain. So, people just know that the grief that comes and attains these things, we try and transform it through words and create things out of them, but they're always there. So please reach out and get help. Contact SADAG, do whatever you like. But if anybody's depressed watching this, for goodness sake, reach out. There is assistance out there, please.
Relebona, I'm going to close with you, and I want to just go back to what Flora said about making sense of things you can't understand, that maybe you can't make sense of things you can't understand. And this idea of perhaps using writing or mythology to just try and frame it for yourself. And you do that in your book so beautifully. So, and I wonder if you could just close off for us on what you've heard Glynis say now as well.
I think she's absolutely right. Love is really what pushes us the most. Having said that, I would like to say that, when somebody does commit suicide, I hope those who are left behind do not feel that they never gave them enough love. And I actually make a point of saying in my book somewhere that, sometimes a person can receive an enormous amount of love and still commit suicide. And then you find maybe there's the lone ranger who somehow makes it through. And in my mind, the way that I reason through it, I suppose, is by thinking of cancer and how some people respond well to chemotherapy and others don't. They've both received the same kind of, treatment, but for some reasons, others survive and others don't. But love definitely is a moving force. Because the pills on their own won't heal you. Therapy can feel redundant and boring at times. All the sort of tools that you're given as a person who is a depressive can feel even heavy. But love is the one thing that I think has the most success of really healing us. And I'm a words of affirmation person. That's how I receive love. And I remember just before going home feeling for my mother's 60th birthday party, surprise birthday party. And just before I'd left for home, which is in Limpopo, I stay in Johannesburg, I was in a very difficult slump. And through being there, seeing all the people who have kind of raised me, all of her friends, and they're all saying, oh, we love you, we're so proud of you. They're saying all these wonderful things. So it was a good and wonderful thing for my mother, but for me as well. And I walked away from that with just a sense of solidness and of being anchored, I suppose. So I think that's what love does. It anchors us. If nothing else, to love someone, to give them a hug, like Alicia was saying, she wishes that she could go back to her younger self and give herself a hug. And, sometimes it's things like that. It's touch, it's just being there. So I think love is the most successful drug that there is out there for a lot of mental illnesses. Even if you think that people can't understand you, for instance, somebody who cannot articulate their thoughts because of whatever mental illness they have, but they have the ability to understand things. And I always say mental illness is not about not having logic. It's just that our logic and our reasoning is different from other people. But we do understand and receive what's happening all around us, the stimuli. And so if you have someone who's, for instance, got a mental illness that's so severe that they've been institutionalized, and you visit them and you think, what's the point of these visits? Because I feel like this person says nothing that's audible. They understand very much. And that visit that you make, once a month, twice a month, 3 times a month, means everything to them. It's just that they don't have the ability to articulate it. And I think even people like me who can speak sometimes struggle to articulate ourselves and to say, thank you for loving me. So I absolutely agree. And I'm sending love to everyone here today, and sending love to all the families who support people like me, and saying thank you on behalf of people like me, because your love really does save us.
So unfortunately, we do need to close off. And in closing, I'd just like to make 2 short comments. I thought a lot about, and I think listening to what you say about love as well, is what it means to read these books, what these books meant, what it meant to read all of your books and your writings and that kind of thing. And the thing that struck me was, well, there's 2 things. There's a song by a guy called Brantley Buffalo. It's a band. And in the song, he sings about the hooks that bind us. These are the hooks that bind us. And I was thinking so much about the fact that what are the hooks that bind us? And I think when we talk about love, that may be a hook that binds us. But for those of us that read, the hooks that bind us are indeed your writing. So to be able to read these experiences and to learn from them and to deepen our own understanding of what it means to be human, but also our own understanding of what it means to be humane, is absolutely critical. And the other thing I thought about was that there's a Japanese art form, you may have heard of it, called kintsugi. And kintsugi is a wonderful art form because what it does is it takes broken pottery and it rebuilds the pottery by gluing the pieces together with gold paint or gold leaf or whatever the case may be. So there's all this brokenness, heartbrokenness, it could be anything, which then gets built up again into something quite extraordinary. And in many ways, your courage to write about what it is that you go through, what it is that you experience, and what it is that you are dealing with even now and will be dealing with throughout into the future, acts as that, it acts as the gold painting and pulling together of the brokenness, but it also helps us really understand what it is that you're experiencing. And as someone has said, to learn from someone else, to learn in order to deal with other friends and family as well. And I think we have huge gratitude to people who write about their own experiences in this way. And we have huge gratitude to writers in general. So on that note, I want to say, Glynis, thank you so much for your time. Relebone, Flora, Alicia, Gillian, you've really offered us an extraordinary insight into your worlds and an honestness and an openness which is profoundly, profoundly valuable. And we want to say thank you for that. And we wish you a good rest of afternoon.